I was sitting alone in a glass-walled boardroom on the 31st floor of a Bay Street tower, watching the gray November rain drag itself across Lake Ontario, when a calendar notification blinked to life on the laptop the advisor had left open on the table. And every instinct I had spent 37 years building told me to stay absolutely, completely still. The notification was small, a pale blue rectangle in the upper corner of the screen. Dinner Adele 7:30 re after V signs finally. Adele, my wife. And V, that was me. Gord Wentworth was the name my assistant had used to book this appointment. My middle name and my mother's maiden name combined. A quiet habit I'd developed after a business rival leaked my medical records to a competitor 15 years ago. The advisor knew me only as a high-net-worth referral, not as Gordon Ashworth, the man who had spent 37 years building one of the largest privately owned commercial property management firms in the Waterloo region, not as Adele's husband. So why was my wife's name on his calendar? I did not lean closer to the screen. I did not reach for my phone. I sat exactly where I was, my hands flat on the glass table, breathing slowly the way I used to breathe before walking into a room full of people who wanted to take something from me. I photographed the screen with my phone, angle low, flash off the way someone might glance at a message. Then I set my phone face down and folded my hands and waited. The door opened. The advisor walked back in, straightening his tie, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the particular smile of a man who believes he is the smartest person in the room. I smiled back. He sat across from me and began laying documents on the glass table. He spoke in the smooth, reassuring cadence of someone who has given this same presentation many times. The language of gentle urgency, of thoughtful concern for my long-term security. He said my portfolio structure was outdated. He recommended consolidating everything, the RRSPs, the TFSAs, the non-registered accounts, the corporate holding structure, under what he called a comprehensive wealth directive. He slid a consent form across the table. Then he said something that made the room go very quiet inside my head. He said that given my recent health concerns, it might be wise to establish a clear power of attorney framework. A full capacity assessment, he explained, was purely a formality, a protective measure, something that would give my loved ones peace of mind. I looked at him. He had never asked about my health. I had not told him anything about my health. My cardiologist in Kitchener was the only person outside my immediate family who knew about the episode I'd had in September. A mild arrhythmia, nothing requiring treatment beyond a few lifestyle adjustments. My wife had made this appointment. My wife had given him that information. I said I would need to review everything with my own lawyer before signing. He nodded with practiced patience and handed me a copy of the documents in a crisp manila folder. We shook hands at the elevator. He told me to take my time. His eyes said something different. In the elevator going down, I opened the folder and flipped to the back page. A capacity assessment referral form, clipped to the inside cover. The referred psychiatrist's name and clinic address were already filled in. An appointment slot was already circled. A Tuesday 3 weeks from now. Someone had been very confident I would cooperate. My wife was supposedly in Halifax that week, visiting her sister. She'd left Monday morning with her carry-on and a list of instructions for the cleaning service, kissed me on the cheek at the door and told me to eat properly. I called her from the car on the drive back to the hotel I'd booked for the night. I stayed in Toronto rather than make the 2-hour drive home. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm and familiar. She said her sister was doing better. She said Halifax was gray and cold. She asked how the meeting went and I said fine, that the advisor seemed thorough, that I'd look everything over before deciding anything. She said that sounded sensible. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. I listened to the background noise on her end. It was wrong, too dense, too much ambient sound, cutlery, low music, the blur of a crowded room. Not her sister's living room in Halifax. I didn't say anything about that either. That evening I sat in the hotel and pulled my estate documents up on my phone. I'd scanned them years ago on Fraser's advice, my longtime lawyer, a practical man who believed in having everything accessible and nothing lost. My wife was listed as sole attorney for personal care and property under my power of attorney. My nephew, my younger sister's son, who'd worked in my company since his mid-20s and whom I'd made VP of operations 4 years ago, was listed as alternate. I stared at those two names for a long time. Then I called Fraser and told him I needed to meet privately. Before 8 the next morning, no calendar entry, no assistance. He didn't ask why. He'd known me for 22 years. He said he'd have coffee ready. I spent the rest of that night building a picture I didn't want to see. By 3 in the morning, I could see it perfectly. My wife had arranged for me to see an advisor who was already in contact with her. The advisor had been briefed on my health, information only she could have provided. He had prepared capacity assessment paperwork before I'd ever walked through his door. Under Ontario law, a person found incapable of managing property can have their power of attorney activated immediately. My wife would gain full legal control of everything: my personal assets, the corporate holding company, 40 years of properties and contracts and accumulated decisions, everything I had built. And my nephew, who had signing authority up to $250,000 per transaction inside my company, would be positioned to do whatever came next. I thought about what each of them was expecting to receive. And then I thought about whether they had ever seriously discussed what they were planning to give each other. In my experience, people who conspire for money rarely agree on the division. One of them always believes they deserve more. I was fairly certain my wife believed she deserved all of it. The following morning, I met Fraser at his office before the building filled up. I laid everything on his desk: the photographed calendar notification, the capacity assessment referral, the advisor's forms, the hotel records my assistant had quietly confirmed after I called in a favor from a former business associate with connections in the industry. My wife had taken an afternoon train to Toronto on Monday and checked into a hotel in Yorkville. She had not been on any flight to Halifax. Fraser listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back and said, "How long do you want to take this?" I said, "All the way." He said he would make calls. Over the following days, while my wife returned from her supposed Halifax trip with duty-free wine and a scarf I would never wear, while she sat across the kitchen table and watched me with the particular attentiveness of a woman who has recently decided she is nearly a widow, I ran a quiet forensic audit of my company's operational accounts going back 8 months. The irregularities were not dramatic. They never are when someone cautious is doing it. 3 recurring vendors, companies I didn't recognize, billing for property maintenance consultations and regional compliance audits, each invoice filed just under the internal review threshold. None of them appeared in our approved supplier registry. All 3 billing addresses traced back to a numbered corporation registered in Alberta. My nephew had been systematically deflating my company's apparent profitability for 8 months. Carefully, specifically in the way that would matter most if someone were trying to force a below-market valuation while its owner was legally unable to object. He had planned to help someone buy my company for a fraction of what it was worth, and that someone was almost certainly himself. I had driven that boy to hockey practice at 5 in the morning when he was 12, in the dark, in a Cambridge winter, because his father had left and his mother worked nights. I had paid for his business degree. I had brought him into my company the week he graduated and taught him everything I knew. I had trusted him with my name on documents. I gave myself 1 hour to sit with what that meant, then I got back to work. I attended the capacity assessment appointment the following Tuesday without telling my wife I was going. I had called the psychiatrist's office and confirmed directly, as if I were a cooperative and slightly confused older man who appreciated having things arranged for him. I wore my reading glasses. I'd had them made years ago for presentations and rarely need them, and I moved a little slowly, answered some questions with deliberate pauses, with the careful vagueness of someone searching for words that should come easily. I watched the psychiatrist write things down, not what but when. She reached for her pen at the right moments. She had already decided what she was looking for. I thanked her warmly and drove home. That evening my wife sat across from me in the living room and asked gently if I'd been feeling more tired lately. She said she'd noticed I seemed a little slower, a little more confused at times. Her face was arranged carefully into concern. She reached out and patted my hand and said she would always look after me, that I didn't have to worry about anything. I said I knew. I said I was lucky to have her. 3 weeks later, I had everything I needed. The Ontario Securities Commission, it turned out, had been looking at my wife's advisor for 14 months. He was not running this scheme with just my family. 6 other elderly clients, people in their late 60s and 70s, some widowed, some in early cognitive decline, all of them high net worth, all of them with spouses or children who had quietly been recruited into the arrangement, had lost significant assets to similar wealth restructuring processes before anyone noticed the pattern. My nephew's Alberta shell companies connected to 2 of those cases through a shared numbered corporation registered to the same Bay Street address as the advisor's secondary office. This was not a domestic dispute. This was a criminal enterprise. My wife was not a naive participant. She was a coordinator who had sourced the client. I had 31 days of legally recorded audio from my own home, one-party consent in Ontario, as Fraser reminded me, including 3 phone calls between my wife and the advisor, and 1 conversation between my wife and my nephew in my own kitchen on a Sunday evening when they believed I was resting upstairs. In that kitchen conversation, my nephew said he was nervous. He said the waiting was hard. He said he had borrowed against what he expected to receive, and the people he'd borrowed from were not patient. My wife told him to hold on a little longer. He said he was trying. She said, "He's not going to fight this. He doesn't have the fight left in him." I stood at the top of the stairs and listened to my nephew agree with her. The dinner was my idea. I told my wife I wanted to bring the people closest to me together. An intimate evening, a chance to talk about the future while I still felt well enough to be part of the conversation. I suggested she invite whoever she thought appropriate. She invited my nephew immediately. I suggested, almost as an afterthought, that perhaps the advisor might appreciate an informal setting to walk me through the documents I still hadn't signed. My wife's smile held for precisely 1 second longer than it should have. She said that sounded like a lovely idea. I cooked the meal myself. Rack of lamb, roasted root vegetables, a bottle of Okanagan Red I'd been saving for something worth marking. I set the table properly. The good china, the silver, the candlesticks. I wanted the room to feel exactly like what it was supposed to be. My nephew arrived looking thin and tired, gripping my hand at the door with the particular force of a man trying to project confidence he no longer has. He said I looked well. I said I felt well. I did not mention that I'd spent the afternoon on the phone with my company's actual lawyers, confirming the court-ordered freeze on the 3 Alberta accounts, or that his signing authority had been formally revoked that morning. The advisor arrived shortly after with an expensive bottle of wine, the gesture of a man celebrating in advance. He settled into his chair at the table with the ease of someone who believes the hard part is already behind him. We ate. I asked my nephew about the Leafs. I asked the advisor about his practice, the way you do at dinner. My wife presided with the brightness of a woman overseeing the final act of a plan that has taken her a very long time to execute. After the plates were cleared, I set my wine glass down. I folded my napkin and I stood up. No reading glasses, no careful hesitation, no searching for words. I stood up straight, the way I have stood at the head of every difficult table for 37 years. And I looked at the 3 of them, and I let them see my face clearly for the first time in 2 months. My wife's expression began to change shape. I told them I had spent the past month doing what I have always done when someone presents me with a document I don't understand. I read every number, every name, and every address carefully until I understood exactly what it said. I reached beneath the sideboard and set a bound file on the table, then another. I told my nephew that I had found his 3 Alberta companies, that I knew what they had billed, what they had received, and where the money had moved afterward. I told him a meeting with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The same Tuesday he had apparently planned to be in Toronto, meeting with a property acquisition lawyer about an asset he was expecting to become available shortly. He went the color of old snow. I set my phone on the table. I played 45 seconds of the kitchen recording. His voice, my wife's voice, the words "he doesn't have the fight left in him," and I let it run until his head dropped forward and he stopped trying to look at anything. Then I turned to the advisor. I told him that the OSC investigator who had been building a case against him for 14 months was now in possession of my complete file. I told him that 6 families he had helped strip of their savings and their legal autonomy would be witnesses in a criminal proceeding that was already scheduled. I told him the case now included mine and that the preliminary charges had been filed that afternoon. He did not speak. He looked at the wine bottle he'd brought and said nothing. I turned to my wife last. She was not crying. I want to be accurate about that. She sat with her back very straight and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 18 years. Not fear exactly. The look of someone recalculating very quickly. She said my name. She said she could explain. I said I knew she could. I said she had always been very good at explaining things. I told her the power of attorney had been formally revoked by Fraser that morning. That her name had been removed from every document in which it appeared. That the phone recordings and the hotel records and the meeting notes between her and the advisor had been provided to the Crown Attorney's office along with a formal complaint. I told her the car waiting downstairs was not a cab. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she picked up her wine glass and finished what was in it. She set the glass down carefully. She stood up and walked to the front hall and took her coat from the hook she had used every day for 12 years, and she left without looking back. My nephew started to speak. I raised one hand and he stopped. I told him I had nothing left to say to him. I told him I had already called his mother, my sister, and that she knew everything, and that I had taken steps to ensure she would not bear any of the financial consequences of what he had done, because she had nothing to do with it and she had already lost enough in her life. Then I asked him to leave my house. He went. I sat alone at the table with the good china and the Okanagan red and the silver my father left me, and I listened to the house settle. Outside, the November rain had come back, quiet and persistent, the way Ontario weather gets in the back half of autumn, patient and relentless and entirely indifferent to whatever is happening inside. I stayed at that table for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I restructured my estate entirely. I rewrote every document. I promoted 3 people inside my company who had earned every year of trust I had in them to the leadership positions my nephew left behind. Fraser coordinated with the OSC, and the case moved forward with the slow certainty of a process that does not need my involvement to function. I thought a great deal about the 6 other families, the ones who had not noticed the calendar notification blinking on a screen at exactly the right moment, the ones who had been handed capacity assessment forms and told to trust the process, and who had trusted it, and who had lost. I spoke with the lawyer for one of those families through Fraser and offered to cover their civil litigation costs myself. 3 months later, I established a small grant program through the Ontario Bar Association, legal aid specifically for elder financial abuse cases, the ones that fall through the gaps because the victim has already been declared incapable of pursuing a remedy. My father was a machinist in Cambridge for 43 years. He retired with a pension that barely covered his property taxes. I used to think that meant he had wasted himself, that careful had failed him. I understand now that I was wrong. He was careful in the ways that matter most. Careful with his word, careful with who he let close. He was never betrayed by the people sleeping in his house. I wish I had learned that part from him sooner. What I know now at 63, sitting in a house that is quiet and entirely my own, a person who wants access to what you have spent your life building will rarely ask you directly. They will arrange the room, manage the light, and wait for you to hand it over yourself. The work is not in catching them afterward. The work is in learning to see the room clearly before you sit down at the table. I see it clearly now. If you have ever had to rebuild trust from the ground up, in a person, in a family, in yourself, I want to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, please hit the like button and subscribe. I'll be here.